For those of you who may be new, Death by Design happens every Monday at this time, 10 a.m. Eastern, and it's a show where we talk about design principles and kind of break down design ideas with the intention of kind of speaking to developers and coming at this from a developer mindset. And we have been historically really focused on kind of the more like technical implementation side of design, right? We've talked a lot about color and like grids and typography, like layout and balance and hierarchy and all this stuff that really has to do with the actual implementation of the design. But as the year is kind of winding down, I want to take a little bit of a step back and talk about actual design process, right? The technical stuff that we've been really focused on is an important set of fundamentals to have, right? But ultimately, design is kind of a combination of things, right? It's theory and it's practice. And in practice, design is about problem solving, and it's about the kind of process that you're walking through to reach the solution that you are eventually going to use those technical skills to implement. But first, before we do all of that, we have to figure out what we're building. And I think especially kind of coming from that dev side of things, that can be something that it's surprisingly easy to skip, right? Which again, like it sounds a little foolish to be like, yeah, people just jump in and start building, but people really do just jump in and start building. And they kind of go based on just assumptions that they've made and haven't really thought necessarily very deeply about the actual product or the goal or the end user. This thing, it kind of happens the same way, right, with JavaScript, right? Like, or any code, any language. All of the technical knowledge is not enough to make you a good developer, right? The things that set apart like a junior developer from a senior developer is your ability to like assess the situation, evaluate the landscape, make judgments about like which tools you want to use, which libraries, all that kind of stuff that really helps flesh out an application that's more than just implementing code, right? And when you approach your design problems with that same kind of mindset, then I think you will see also a lot of success. A lot of times, especially for new designers or even new developers, they're so excited they're encouragingly excited to implement what they have just learned that they want to like rush to the computer. They want to like open their code editor, open Figma and start work like right away. And that can lead to work that is interesting or beautiful or aesthetic, from a design standpoint, but not necessarily practical or usable. And that often means that it lands in their portfolio or it gets like posted on Dribbble or Pinterest or Twitter, and it kind of makes the rounds just like, isn't this gorgeous? But very rarely is that stuff actually in a real application. And ideally, we really want to avoid this kind of shallow design, this like design for design's sake. I think there is a place for it. It's a fun way to experiment. Like if you're just designing for fun, you're like trying to hone your skills or like try out a new trend or like you're trying to learn, Figma a little bit better. It's great to just kind of like play around with design. But when you are like at work, when you're building a real application, when you're building a real product, it's just kind of a different situation. So I really wanted to talk about process, right? And over the next kind of couple of episodes, I'm going to kind of walk through what I think about when I think about like my design process and how I approach a new design or a new feature or an entirely new application, when I'm really like just sitting down for the first time, right? How do we take something from idea to an actual thing that we are ready to sit down and open Figma and design? So ultimately, every designer is going to kind of find their own process that suits them, but I've found that it usually includes some version of these same steps, right? And it could be like you've switched up the order and you do one before another, or you've got some tweaks, but ultimately this kind of stuff is kind of the basics. And the more you design things and the more you kind of walk through this process on your own, the more you'll kind of get a feel for what works for you and what doesn't. You'll add to and alter the steps, and you'll find something that is entirely your own that works really well for you. So today, I really want to talk about just identifying the problem. Which again, so much of this is one of those things that's going to sound like retrospectively obvious. Like, of course, like we start by figuring out what the problem is, but a lot of times that actually gets skipped. It's really tempting to just jump right in and start working without really taking the time to identify what we are solving with this thing that we're creating. But a good designer is always going to take the time to pause and really fully explore and understand the problem before we start to develop a solution. A lot of times when we don't do this, we find that we are working on our own assumptions or our own biases, and those get built into the work in a way that's really detrimental to the user. And it leads to a lot of wasted time and a lot of wasted effort as we go back and try to fix or mitigate things that aren't actually working. And that's kind of the best scenario, right? In the worst case scenario, we do some harm because we haven't fully considered the way that something might not work in a way that could be actually pretty disastrous to users. So anytime you are presented with this kind of like, you have an idea or someone makes a suggestion or you're handed a new task, I really think it's wise to pause, take a breath, right? And say, what is the root problem that this new thing is solving? Especially when you're functioning as kind of an individual contributor, you often just kind of get handed assignments to build stuff. You're in sprint planning and someone assigns a ticket to you and they're like, all right, this is your problem for the next 2 weeks. And a lot of times the instinct is just to be like, okay, cool, I'm on it, because we make that assumption that someone else has done this work, right? That a product team has done this work or a designer has done this work. But more often than not, that's not actually the case, right? Worst case scenario, right? They're also working on that gut feeling or those unvalidated assumptions. And by kind of stopping to ask hey, what are we solving with this? You can really help prevent that waste of time and resources. In the best case scenario, they have already done it, right? They have done the research, they've talked to the users, they've explored this already, and they can share it with you. And that gives you, as a developer, a more thorough understanding of what exactly it is you are building. And you can use that information to shape the choices that you're making as you're building this. Either way, kind of stopping to ask that question, ask about the core problem, is really going to benefit your work. And it's something that I never really thought deeply about doing because it seemed so intrinsic to me as part of the design process, right? And so when I first kind of made that transition over into working as a developer, I think my bosses probably thought I was really annoying at first because I was constantly stopping them to ask why. Why are we building this? What's this doing? What's the goal of this? What's the benefit of this? Who's going to use this? All of these questions where I was really just trying to grok the full issue because I didn't feel like I had the information that I needed to build. And a lot of times the feedback I was getting back from that was generally positive, but also they would kind of be like, Kathryn has this real designer's mind or whatever. And I was like, what are you talking about? I'm just asking questions, But not to toot my own horn, but I think that's a really beneficial thing to do, right? When you first get handed something, to take that step back and ask why. Taking a brief break here. Hey, Thindle. Good to see you back. I'm doing well today. How are you doing? Hope everyone's doing well. We're just kind of hanging out this morning, taking a pretty chill day, right? But jumping back into that kind of idea of asking why, right? Good designers ask why. And it does feel annoying when you start because you feel kind of like a toddler, right? Like, have you ever had a conversation with a child and they're constantly you say something and they go, why? And it's like, oh my God, just take my word for it. But ultimately in design, it's a really good practice to question everything because there are a lot of assumptions and a lot of biases in software creation. And the more you build that habit of continually stopping to ask why, the more you can kind of break down that structure, right? So, sorry, I got distracted a little bit by the comments. I'm sorry that you were sick, man. That sucks. I'm glad it wasn't COVID, but also it's not fun to be sick ever, right? And I like this. This is the one that cracked me up. Bad case of the man flu. Must have been 2 to 3 times worse than you can imagine, right? Oh, it's that time of year. I was recently on a trip and came back, and I was just waiting. I didn't get sick, which feels like a blessing. But I was so sure. I was just like holding my breath, like I was on an airplane and I talked to a bunch of people and I went places, so here it comes. I did get my COVID booster shot though last week, which knocked me down for a couple days. It always does. It's worth it to be done and to have the extra little boost going into the holidays, but also like, damn, that sucks. I don't know how they engineered this thing such that every time you get the shot, you experience a completely different random set of side effects, but they sure have done a good job. Because not once have I ever had the same experience as the last shot. It's a roll of the dice every single time. Oh man, up to 5. 4 boosters. I'm trying to like think through that. I think I have 4 altogether if you count, right? Because there's 2. The very first one was a 2-shot set. And then I got a booster around this time last year and a booster this year. You got me beat. You got so many boosters. You're so safe, man. No wonder you didn't get COVID. You are ultra protected. It's a good thing. I'm not like dunking on you, to be clear. I'm just like trying to math that out in my head, how that worked out for you. But yeah, okay. Jumping back, I'm gonna do this. I'm just gonna like meander. You get to get yours early. That's nice. It's good. It's good that you're able to protect your family that way. 3 cheers for COVID boosters. Ooh, what are we doing today? That's a good question. So I talked a little bit when I first got on, but also I always fall into this trap where I like start the episode. I'm like, today we're going to talk about X, but nobody's watching yet because I've just started it. You know, like we're 2 minutes in and I'm like, here's the plan for today. And by the time people join, that's all gone. They've missed it. So what I wanted to talk about both today and for like the next kind of couple of weeks was this idea of like design process, right? And we've been super focused on like the technical implementation of design and really looking at like colors and fonts and layouts and stuff. And like really, how do you implement these ideas? So today and kind of through the rest of this year, I want to take Dev by Design sessions to talk through design process and how we approach problems and kind of the design mindset that you can bring. So that's what we're doing today. We're just kind of hanging out and chatting is really what it boils down to. Because the thing about design process, for better or worse, there's not like visual examples of a lot of this. So you kind of just got me talking. So definitely folks in the chat, pop in, because otherwise it's just going to be me talking for an hour. Nobody wants that, most of all me. So, but where I was kind of chatting, where I was talking before we started chatting, was in this idea of kind of asking why, right? When you first get handed something new, and kind of taking this designer's mindset to saying like, what's the purpose of this? What problem is this solving? Because design ultimately at its core is problem solving. I think that is one of the things that sets it apart from art, right? Is that art is just creation, getting to like make something new and cool and experimentation without necessarily needing to have a given purpose. Whereas design is always kind of solving a problem or communicating a message. It's got a very targeted and specific thing that it needs to communicate. And if it doesn't communicate that, then it's not a great design, right? So this question of always asking why, and maybe sounding a little bit annoying, kind of helps us drill things down, right? Because if we end up in this situation where, just to like talk through an example, someone hands you a thing and they're like, all right, here's your ticket for this sprint. We need you to build this really like complex filtering function on this database for user files, right? And it's like, oh, why? Well, because there was a request from a user. And a lot of times, like, that's where the conversation ends. And you're like, all right, I guess I'm building this, like, thing. But if we keep asking why, then we can really drill down into what is actually going on that's causing a user to request this. And we might be able to come up with a solution that meets the user's needs a little bit better than what they thought that they needed. So if we ask again and we're like, why? And we get back, they're having difficulty locating the files that they're working in. They want to really quickly be able to reopen them. It's like, why are they really struggling with that? Well, it turns out our system is alphabetically organizing by file name. So if you've got a whole bunch of files and you're looking for one at the end of the alphabet, it's way at the end of some big long list. We're like, what? That's annoying. Maybe that's our actual problem that needs solving, as opposed to, building this filtering system. Maybe we need to look at the way that we are organizing files in the UI. So it's not necessarily that a user actually wants to be able to sort and filter so much as they want to be able to quickly re-access a file that they were working in. Maybe what we need is a recently opened section that hangs out at the top and shows the last 5 to 10 touched files, and that could prevent us from spending a lot of time and a lot of effort building in a really complex UI, like a big filtering UI, when it turns out that our users are most likely, they just want to sort by date modified, right? They just want to get at their most recent stuff. So by kind of asking and digging in, we can really start to A, figure out what the actual problem is, and then B, possibly come up with a better answer than if it was just going based on assumptions. People are having trouble finding files, so we need to build X, when really, maybe we need to build Y. So we're in a better place than we were before, but in that kind of situation, we're still mostly working within the confines of just kind of word of mouth, right? If we get assigned something and we ask a question back, we're usually talking to an internal product manager, maybe a customer support tech, maybe a boss. And even that's probably kind of secondhand, right? And it's been translated or adapted from some ticket that they got or a conversation they had with a user or someone who came up to a booth at a conference to complain about something. So our problem is kind of starting to take shape. We have a hint, and those things are good. To be fair, I don't want to disparage, submitting a support ticket, because often that's a good first step to identifying a problem. It doesn't necessarily mean, though, that we need to jump on it right away and implement exactly that, what one person was suggesting. It means that we've now got a hint, and that starts our problem-solving process to dig into what's going on here? Is there only one person that's having trouble with this, or is this actually a bunch of users are struggling with this? Only this one person has actually bothered to submit a ticket so far, right? With that kind of thing, we need to start validating. So before we really dig in to be all right, time to start solving, time to start coding, time to open that Figma file, we need to validate the information that is coming to us. So kind of, is this right first? Is this actually something that a user has asked for? Or is this something that is coming from a product team or a CEO or somebody else internal that's the next step on our roadmap is X, right? And it's not necessarily, again, it's not bad. Just think of it kind of like a code smell or a red flag, right? If you're working on something that no user has mentioned or asked for. If this idea is coming from sales or from product, then the very first step, I think, is to kind of talk through why they feel this new feature is needed. And a lot of times it's a great idea, and it could be a really great fit for the product. But other times, I think it's really easy for folks to get hung up on older roadmaps or visions of the application that they have just kind of in their mind, or personal biases of what they would want if they were a user, but they're not necessarily a user, right? And the way developers think about things is often super different from the way your everyday user thinks about things. Software grows and evolves, and what's in our head, the kind of vision that we had for this piece of software when we first started coding it, might not match up to the reality of how the user base is actually using the product by, whatever version 5, 6, 7. So if we kind of have this gut feeling about what the application needs, or we're kind of hearing that back from sales or from product, and they haven't kind of done some user testing or talked to some users or validated that already, then the next step should really be for us to kind of like throw a red flag and be like, hey, let's talk to some users, let's sit down with them. Let's hear about what their processes are. Let's see how this new idea would fit in. Would it fit in at all? Or could it possibly cause some problems for them? Is this something that they want? Is this a response to a problem that they're having? Or is this just vibes? And we really, really, really want to avoid programming or designing based on vibes alone. Yeah, so we're going there. I was debating internally whether we were going to talk about Twitter, but I think we got to talk about Twitter, right? I mean, if we're talking about people who are moving fast, breaking things, not necessarily validating ideas, we've kind of got a case study happening right in front of our eyes, right? So we've kind of seen this. Obviously, there was this big takeover for Twitter. We're not gonna name names here. We're just gonna talk about Twitter. And there was this assumption that things needed to be fixed, right? And that this one person had the idea that was going to fix it. And that didn't take into account the actual users and the ways that the users were already using the platform and had already kind of had patterns of use with the software, right? So this idea of validation, right? Something's wrong with validation. We need to fix validation. Not intrinsically wrong, right? There were some problems with validation. There were some problems, like, Twitter Blue, not like super, super successful. So there's this gut feeling, right? Let's combine these. Let's monetize this. Let's improve, let's fix some of these spam problems. This will be good, right? But that wasn't validated in any way. There was no kind of exploration of why that decision was made or how it could go wrong if we do decide to implement this. It was just like, build it. And when we don't stop to ask why, this is kind of what happens, right? And there were some unforeseen consequences to this quick implementation because the design process wasn't actually there. It just got skipped entirely in favor of like ship. So now we're in this place where the validation system is actually a little bit worse, to put it kindly, than it was before, because there was no exploration of what the actual problem was and what the users needed. There was just a gut feeling, an assumption, a personal bias that was acted on, and then chaos, kind of, right? So the more we can do to actually explore this, explore what our ideas are, where this feeling is coming from, what this might actually solve, the better we're going to be. The other thing that I want to kind of talk about with that is this idea of like the happy path and the unhappy path, right? So often when we are designing or when we are developing, we're focused, obviously, on the happy path, which is basically the things that we expect the users to do that will lead them to their desired outcome. Right? So if somebody opens up your application and you want them to, I don't know, I'm trying to think of like a task, right? Send a message. You're like, oh, okay. So they open up the thing, they click on the little mail button, they click on the name of the user they want to message, they type a message, they hit the enter button, or they hit the little, send button, and done. Message is sent. That's the happy path in which everything goes perfectly correct. However, for every happy path, there is also an unhappy path, right? And that's when something goes wrong. A user gets lost, or they don't understand what an icon means, or they misclick, or there's a typo, or, whatever. Things go wrong because we're humans, and humans make mistakes. So often when we are building, we're thinking about this ideal user or this like robotic kind of user that does everything perfect every time. And we're not building in human error, and we're not building in, patterns of abuse, how people could take advantage of something like this, how people could use it incorrectly for harm. We're just kind of building based on the happy path that we want the users to do. So it's not like fun to do, to sit down and think about like, how could everything go wrong? But it is super, super crucial. I worked at a company that used to do what they called pre-mortems, and I really liked that. Is obviously, if you're not familiar, the idea of a post-mortem is like a meeting that you have after some shit hits the fan. Usually something has gone pretty wrong and you're all called in for a post-mortem to break down what happened, right? Like, how did this happen? Why did this happen? How can we prevent it happening again? By holding a pre-mortem, they were basically asking everyone to come in and sit down and think about all of the ways in which something could go wrong and then how we could prevent it. So basically, let's assume something breaks and talk about how we could fix it. What are the most likely ways in which this could be broken, abused, taken advantage of? And by getting everyone on board to basically brainstorm ways we could break a feature, we prevented a lot of unhappy path kind of executions, right? Because it got us ahead of that curve and we weren't waiting to like respond to something going wrong. We were anticipating ways that it could go wrong and building around that from the get-go. So that's also a part of the design process, is kind of being really conscious of things that could be broken or abused or used wrongly, and taking the time to fully explore the unhappy path as well as the happy path. Another thing, kind of branching off this idea of the user request, is validating whether this is something that one user has asked for or something that a whole group of users have asked for, because those hold different weights if we're being honest, right? It is not unheard of to get something that is presented as a user request and learn that that means there is just one upset dude who really, really wants you to build something. And again, sometimes that could be a great idea. Sometimes that one person has nailed it and you're like, oh my God, how did I not think of that? Thank you. But sometimes that's not the case. And that one user is kind of an outlier, right? Again, never want to dismiss things out of hand. What we want to do is take the time to validate. So when we talk with other users, when we, implement this, when we're doing user testing, when we're like checking with focus groups, when we're talking to customer support, those are all ways that we can try to figure out if this is actually a common problem or if this is just something that would benefit that one person's like flow, right? And again, that also kind of gets weighted differently. I've had situations where if that one person is a very like high paying customer, sometimes you build the thing, even if it's just what that one person wants. But you got to take the time to figure that out and not feel like you're just jumping on every single suggestion that comes in because you have to. You don't have to, right? Ultimately, the designer or the design team or even the engineering team is going to have a better like bird's eye view of what the application is, what its purpose is, and kind of where they see it going in the future. And no application can be all things to all people. When we see apps that try to do that, they often kind of lose their way, and by becoming less focused, they become less effective. So this feeling of like, we have to jump on every single suggestion, well, maybe not. When you think about, does this suggestion further the business purpose that we have? Does this get us where we want to go? Is this our target audience, or is this something else that's kind of distracting? And that involves talking to a really diverse collection of your users, right? Because the other thing that's easy to kind of fall in the trap of is just talking to your power users, your users who are, most engaged with your brand already. Because that's easy. Those people want to talk to you. That's great. Like genuinely, that is great. That sounded kind of sarcastic when I said it, but that is actually awesome when you have an engaged user base. However, your user base is bigger than the people who are engaged and passionate about your product, and you need to be talking to them as well. The people that are excited for you and that are going to back you and going to talk to you no matter what are probably going to support you even kind of through a misstep. And they'll tell you and they'll communicate that to you, and you'll get the opportunity to fix it. A user that's less engaged will probably just bail. They're not going to hang around necessarily and wait for you to fix something. They're just going to find something new. They're going to move over to a competitor. So by making an effort to talk to your users who are not the super loud, super engaged, super excited folks, you will get a better, more accurate view of kind of who's using your software and what those people want, right? That also includes, talking to a diverse group of users in terms of race, religion, role, culture, all of that, because their answers are going to be very, very different. An example of that I've got, right? My team once asked users to rank kind of their most wanted features. And that's not, to be clear, not my current company. At a past job, when I was an individual contributor front-end developer, we sent out a poll, and we wanted people to rank, what do you want us to build next kind of thing, right? And we got back kind of an overwhelming majority for this one feature. And we were like, cool. But when we looked closer, we found that survey group was mostly men. And they ranked security features, stuff like your blocking, your muting, your reporting. That stuff was way lower on the list to them as compared to the women who replied, who ranked that way higher. There were fewer women who responded to the poll. So it looked like those security features were less wanted, but really they were just highly wanted by a smaller group, right? Majority rule is not necessarily always the best choice, especially if you don't know for sure that your test group is representative of your full user base. The people that responded to that poll were not necessarily reflective of the percentages of our entire user base. They were just reflective of the people who clicked on that poll, right? So for us to make decisions based on that was a little bit wrong. Not a little bit. That was incorrect. And had we moved based on that, we probably would have eventually lost female users of our product because they wouldn't have felt safe on our platform. Sometimes features are important enough, especially, right, something like a security feature, that they need to be prioritized kind of regardless of what's going on, because those users they're important. I'm trying to find a better way to say that. I feel like I had a good rant going and then I kind of lost my way. But just to say that, again, the people that are going to respond to polls, that are going to engage with you, that are going to be the loudest and the most excited, are not necessarily representative of the entirety of your user base. It's important to kind of go out of your way to check what everybody wants, because there might be something that you're overlooking that's really, really important. Quick break to say hello to new folks that have joined. Hello, Nick. Hello, anybody else that has hopped in. We're glad to see you. Welcome to Dev by Design. Today, we are talking about design process. Today and for the next several weeks through the rest of the year, we are talking about design process. Today specifically, we're talking about problem solving, finding the problem and validating the problem, right? Before we jump right in and start designing or start coding, just making things, it's important from a design perspective to stop and ask why, and to validate what it is that we are trying to build, trying to accomplish, and whether this is actually the best way to do so. So we've talked a little bit about just kind of asking why and stopping and not moving based on assumptions. Now we're kind of talking about ways of validating, right? Seeing if this is something your users have asked for, if it's just one user or multiple users, if it's just your power users, if you're talking to everybody who is in your user base, etc., etc. One of the other things that I think is worth considering, right, and we talked about this just briefly earlier, is whether a change aligns with the future vision for your product. Because you have to think long-term about what the goals of an application are. What are you trying to do? What problem at a super high level? Not what problem does this feature solve? What problem, what gap does this piece of software solve? What is this filling, right? And if one feature doesn't align with that greater goal, then that's an indication that the feature isn't necessarily right, or that we might be straying from the path, from the problem that we had first imagined solving with this software. Eventually, we have to draw the line, right? Because it's really easy for that like scope creep to kind of come in, right? Where you're like, well, we've already got, here's an example, right? So I was working for a company previously that would give you, they were kind of like Myers-Briggs-ish, right? You took an assessment and then it would tell you about your thinking preferences. So how you are most likely to approach issues, problems in the workplace, the ways that you were more inclined to think about things, right? Were you more emotional and sensitive? Were you more logical and serious? Whatever, blah, blah, blah. So we were building a piece of software that would allow a user to take this assessment and then view their results online. And then we go, well, wouldn't it be cool for you to be able to compare your results with somebody else's online? Great. Yes, it would. That would be super useful in the workplace. Then that opens the door into like, okay, now we're talking about user privacy and, can a user share their results with someone else? And are we doing this at a workplace level, or are we allowing people to like, I'm going to say friend, even though it wasn't really like a social network, right? Are we allowing people to friend anybody who's taken an assessment and compare their results? Or are you limited to just comparing results with people also within your organization? Within your organization, can you compare with anybody? Can you compare with the CEO, or are you only limited to connecting with people that are on your specific team or in your specific department? And then, well, what if I do this and I want to share my results, right? Should there be a messaging? And then, messaging opens up a whole new can of worms because, right, that's something that can be super easily abused. And so all of a sudden you go from like, we want to show users the results of their personal assessment to we're effectively creating an inner office social network. And once you do that, you need to start thinking about, again, like the security features, blocking, muting, whatever. We need to start thinking about reporting if people are abusing the direct messaging system. We need to start thinking about individual user privacy. Do they want to share their information? Do you want, your assessment results to be completely visible to everybody in your organization? Can that be abused by people who are hiring, who are looking at changing roles within the organization? All of a sudden, by adding this kind of comparison feature, things have changed, right? Ultimately, we decided that was in line. Despite the fact that it came with some challenges, that was something that brought a lot of value to the product, and we wanted to go in that direction anyway, even though we had to be really careful and really thoughtful and really intentional about it. But I think it would also be fair to look at that situation and draw the line and say, you know what, that's actually not the business that we're in. We don't really want to build anything even closely resembling a social network. We really want this to be focused on education and on a single user getting their results, understanding and exploring their results, right? We want this to be single user focused, not multi-user connection focused. Totally valid, And I think those kinds of problems come up all the time. And it's easy for them to kind of start to snowball in the same way that they did at that company, where it's like, you end up in this like, if you give what's the children's book? If you give a mouse a cookie, right? Then if this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens. And it's kind of our duty to fully explore each one of those various side paths to make sure that we're not thoughtlessly implementing something that can come back to bite us, right? That we're being really careful, that we're being intentional, that we're caring for our users, right? That we're not doing things quickly and thoughtlessly in a way that could eventually harm them. So kind of saying like, does this align with our future vision? Is this a responsibility that we are willing to take on? That's all important, and that's all part of the design process as well, right? Because I hear some people I've gotten the feedback before when I'm kind of asking these questions or when I'm at work, people are like, this isn't our problem. This isn't design work. This isn't engineering work. This is product work. I'm not a product manager. This is not my problem. And I disagree. I think that if you are involved in the creation of anything, any piece of software, any feature, then yeah, you do actually have a responsibility. You have an ethical responsibility. You have a just being a good engineer responsibility to ask these questions, to really explore what you were building, why you were building it, and whether there's a potential for it to go wrong. I think it's fair to say that product often holds the most responsibility for this, and it's often their job to go find the answers to those questions, but it is absolutely your responsibility to ask those questions. Everyone on the team has a responsibility to think about these things and ensure that we are all moving in the right direction together, and that we're being thoughtful and careful about what we build. Because knowing the answers to that are not only going to prevent you from creating something horrific, they are also just generally going to help you make better choices while you are building. They allow you to kind of bring the context of user understanding into your work. So when you are sitting down and you're thinking through, all of those design questions, when you're choosing typefaces, when you're setting the layout, when you're doing your colors, when you are choosing JavaScript libraries, when you are, building out components, like all of it, wherever it falls in your process, knowing what the user actually really wants out of this is going to make the product better, because we're all more clearly focused on the same end goal. Whew. So that was my rant for today. Thank you for tuning in. I feel like that's basically what Dev by Design has come, is I just get on first thing Monday morning and I do a little design rant for 45 minutes to an hour. And that's that. As always, if you have any questions or any thoughts, or you disagree with me, throw them in the chat. I love to talk to folks in the chat. But it's been on my mind a lot, especially again with all of the hoopla with Twitter and this idea of I know it's been a couple years since people were saying move fast and break things, but I don't think that mentality is entirely gone from our industry. I think often there is this feeling that speed and how fast can we ship and how much can we ship is the ultimate path to success. And I really want to push back on that because I think that that may have been true at one point. I don't personally believe that it's true anymore. I think that we are in an era of tech where you can quickly be unseated by something that came later but was more thoughtful, more intentional, and has a better design. So there's a little bit of my own personal bias in there for sure. But I think the more we can do to be really considerate and be careful and be really proud, I think, of what we create, be able to stand behind what we create and know that we've explored the options and we feel genuinely that we have the best solution. That's worth a lot more than being the first person to have something that hits the market. And we will do a lot less harm along the way. And guess what? That's really fucking important too. So on that note, hopefully you brought up some stuff to think about. Or maybe you just listen and you're like, she's crazy. Either way, hope you have a good week. I'm going to be back next week. We do Dev by Design every single Monday. Well, pretty much every Monday, barring holidays and trips and stuff. Every Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit about the exploration phase of the design process. So once you have validated that this is the right problem that you want to solve and you feel good about it and you feel correct, then what do you do to start to actually come up with the right solution? So that's next week. Tune back in. I hope you guys have a lovely week. And I will see you guys later.